welcome tonight to Farmville's former passenger station for Northern Western Railway. This is a site where many people, many times a day, this many people would be gathered in this building. So it's good to see a big crowd again tonight. I want to welcome you all here tonight. Tonight is October 18, 2005. This will be the last program of my presidency for the last 2 years. And I kind of wanted to go out on somewhat of a high note with an interesting program. And, well, I think we found that. And I can't wait to get to it. First, just for a note for your convenience, we do have restrooms in the building. There's a men's room right there, a women's room just around the corner, and then around the corner again. And then if everything gets real busy, there's one in the way back into the baggage section of the building on the far end. So if need be, please. I'd also like to have a happy announcement tonight that the Society has been the recipient of a $1,000 grant from the Walter J. Payne Foundation. Thank you, Mr. Payne. This money we targeted or earmarked towards working towards the collections and archival supplies to do our collections and get them together and put them in a type of organized fashion that people may access one day and research different things about Prince Edward County. We felt that by having an organized accessioning of these items, it would help others, encourage them to donate more items to the Historical Society for their preservation and use by the citizens of the county. So we thank you, Mr. Payne, and we will probably try to apply next year for another grant. Julian Covington had a good suggestion. Julian, tell them what you were thinking.
Well, maybe we could get another grant and raise all these cemeteries in the county.
Okay, because
a lot of them get torn up, bulldozed on top of it.
Okay.
And destroyed.
Okay, exactly. So we might apply next year for a grant to get a GPS locator type of thing. We can sit directly on top of the tombstone and get exact coordinates as to where that tombstone and grave is located. So I think that'll help. It'll help with other things as well as some supplies to maybe clean stones with, like florist stuff that just stick the flowers in is good for scraping off and cleaning stones with. And we can come up, I'm sure, with a list of supplies we could use for that endeavor. And maybe using it towards publishing the results as well. So, thank you, Mr. Payne. In keeping with the collections also, I'd like to announce we did have some more things donated, and they were just given to us. We haven't had a chance to go through them yet, but Julia Cox has given us some materials here of papers and books and things. And also, a fellow by the name of Khalid Hashim Bey has donated to the Society some research he has done on some ancestors of the Scott family here in Prince Edward County. And these are African Americans. So this is extremely valuable knowledge to have, research, so we're very pleased to have this. I can't wait to go over this myself and check it out. And by all means, if you're here tonight, take a look at it. I'd also like to direct you to the roster over here. When you come in the door, if you don't mind signing the register. And we have a donation box if you care, and also a flyer or a brochure to join the Society. At $15 a year per individual, $25 a household is definitely the best entertainment value in Farmville. So we encourage your membership, and we'd love to have you. We also have a web page, which Edwina administers, and that is fpehs.org. First letters to Farmville-Prince Edward Historical Society.org. So by all means, you can go to that just about any time. She has been archiving all sorts of information and things on that, and it is growing by leaps and bounds every month. I also want to thank tonight William Lynn. William, who helped us out tonight with a slide projector, sound system, and a screen for this wonderful presentation. And I want to thank you for helping us out there, William. And he will be here to grant any type of assistance should we need it. Well, does anybody have any announcement you want to make historically related? Anything going on in town you notice? Destruction of a building, cemetery desecrated, anything to that effect? Okay, very well. I'd Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present to you tonight a colleague of mine in publishing, and this fellow is a business associate and a man who is nationally acclaimed for his work in paranormal activity and in Virginia Ghosts, and the whole state of Virginia and America owes this man a great debt of gratitude because he has done a wonderful job. How many books have you done now? Yes. 19. Okay. Sold over 200,000 copies, and I can't wait. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to Farmville my good friend, L.B. Taylor.
Thank you, Robert, for that very generous introduction. I didn't expect that. It's a lot better than the one I got a few weeks ago when I spoke to a woman's club. I won't mention the name of it. But they said, Mr. Taylor, we don't expect you to be witty, charming, or intellectual. Just be yourself. And it's such a good gathering here. I like to tell my one Halloween story. And that is a few years ago in Williamsburg, they were having a mass costume dance. And a young couple was getting ready to go, and at the last minute, the young lady said, I've developed a headache, I don't feel well. Why don't you go on to the ball and have a good time, and I'm going to bed. And reluctantly, he did. And she did go to bed, and about an hour later, she felt a lot better, and she got up and she said, well, maybe I'll go to the dance after all. Since my husband hadn't seen my costume or mask, I can observe his behavior unbeknownst to him. So she did, and when she got there, she said he was in the middle of the dance floor going from one young lady to another. She finally had enough. She cut in. Said he made some very improper advances to her, even invited her out to the car. She was very upset, so she went home. And about an hour later, he sauntered in, and she said, well, did you have a good time at the dance tonight? And he says, well, I'll tell you, a funny thing happened. When I got there, some of the fellows grabbed me, went into the back room and played poker all night, and I lost some money. I didn't have any fun at all. But the fellow that borrowed my costume said he had a great time. I'm going to talk a little bit about Virginia Ghosts, and the first thing I always say when I give these talks is I'm not here to make a believer out of anybody. If you believe, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine. And probably most of us are somewhere in between. We've been arguing about whether or not ghosts exist for the past 4,000 years, and I doubt if we'll settle it tonight. The next question that people ask me is, have I seen a ghost? And I have not. I've not experienced one in any way, shape, or manner. Although I've tried. I've slept in the bed and breakfasts, in the haunted bedrooms, and I've walked into cemeteries at night, and nothing seems to happen to me. So I think some people are more sensitive to this kind of phenomenon than others, and apparently I'm not so blessed, or cursed, however you want to look at it. But I have been scared. And I'd like to show you that. It was at this house, which is in Bowling Green, Virginia, south of Fredericksburg. It's called Old Mansion. It's over 300 years old, and a lot of very weird things happened there over the years. There were murders, there were suicides. One woman allegedly was frightened to death. And the owner invited me up a few years ago to get a tour of the house and learn of its history. And as you can see, there's a long driveway leading into it. I got there about 8 o'clock at night, pitch black, I couldn't see anything. Drove down the driveway, got out of the car, and all of a sudden, something thumped me in the chest, knocked me back a step or two, and I said, well, young man, you're going to have your first live encounter. But it turned out to be the owner's large, friendly black lab. So that's as close as I've come. Now, when we get into the subject of ghosts, I like to say that probably 99% or better of what people perceive to be ghostly activity really can be explained by scientific or rational means. Old houses do croak and groan. Train going by can rattle dishes in a cabinet. You have certain physical phenomena, marsh gas or clouds or things that are misinterpreted. And especially when a loved one passes on, a mother or grandmother or whatever, people may hallucinate and believe they see that person in passing when they actually don't. And then some people might have a nip or two of brandy too much, and they just imagine things. So you can explain probably, like I say, better than 99% by these means. But that still leaves that 1% or less, which to me are some cases that are inexplicable. These are the ones that I've tried to track down the last 20-odd years, traveling all around the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I'd like to show you a few slides that people have sent me over the years that I actually have no explanation for. Now the first one is the one that was taken at Woodlawn Plantation in Northern Virginia, adjacent to Mount Vernon, by a professional photographer. He was in a room shooting period furniture. No one else was in the room. And does anybody notice anything a little unusual about this picture? You can see it.
Yes, I can. See the lady's foot is back.
If you look closely, you'll see the silhouette of a booted foot here, and over here a fainter second boot. And the photographer has absolutely no explanation for this. He doesn't know how it happened or why, although he said his film and camera were in fine working order. Now this is the first in a series of photos taken at Upper Brandon Plantation, which is near Hopewell, Virginia, by a lady a few years ago. She was taking them of her two daughters, sitting in front of a fireplace. She was going to send them out with their Christmas cards that year. And as the sequence develops, the lady said none of this appeared to the naked eye as she was taking the photos, and the camera was in fine working order. And the only explanation we can come up with, according to her, is that Upper Brandon's had the reputation of being haunted for the past 140 or so years. Now this you may recognize. This is called the Old Stone House. It's in the middle of the Manassas National Battlefield Park in Northern Virginia. And of course, two great battles during the Civil War were fought here. And this building was used as a temporary hospital. Many, many young men died here well before their time. And it too has had the reputation of being haunted for the past 140 years. A few years ago, one of the administrative park offices at the battlefield was in the building after it had closed to the public for the day, taking photos of period furniture again. No one else was in the building, and when she got her film back, you can see it appears to be an apparitional figure running the entire length of the photo. Now in this case, the lady sent her film and camera to Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York. They said it was in fine working order. They had no explanation for this. And she had a friend at the FBI laboratories in Washington, which I realize is not a great story these days, but nevertheless, he told her he didn't know exactly what it was, but he thought it was human-like in nature. Now, if you look at the configuration of this lady from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, came down to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond a few years ago, wanted to take a photograph of the large granite monument there dedicated to the Confederate dead. And when she got her film back, you can see a similar apparitional figure totally obliterating the monument behind it. And some people have told me that since the lady was from up north, perhaps the Confederates didn't want her to take it. But to give you other examples of some of these configurations, this is a shot taken in Pounding Mill, Virginia, way down in the southwest section, at a bed and breakfast by a professional photographer in the den. And again, he has no way to explain why this happened. There was no flash used. And the only thing we can say is the great-grandmother of the current owners is said to come back from time to time to make sure the bed and breakfast is being properly cared for. Now this is a shot taken in Croker, Virginia, about 4 years ago by a lady. Croker's near Williamsburg. Crystal clear night. She went out to take shots of her Christmas decorations. There was no fog, no clouds, no mist, and this is what she got. And here we get to a subject that to me is a little bit controversial. there are groups all over Virginia, well, all over the country, I guess now, but particularly in Virginia, that are amateur ghost hunters. And they go to sites with infrared film, tape recorders, magnetometers, whatever. And they sometimes get these circles of light with their digital cameras, and they call these orbs. And to some, quote, amateur parapsychologists, unquote, they think these are spirits. Whether they are or not, I couldn't tell you. But some people believe that. And they believe that a shot like this, which they say is a vortex or an orb in motion, is a spirit in motion. I would think you'd have to do a little more on the proof side to convince me, but that's a lot of people believe in it. Now, this was sent to me by a lady in Montvale, Virginia, over near Roanoke, and it appears to be the silhouette of a hooded woman in the lower right-hand corner and the large orb in the upper left-hand corner. And here we have a very interesting photograph. She took a shot of her dog Binky in the backyard. This is Binky. This dog was not there when she took the photo. Okay, now this is my favorite, I guess. This is a series of photos sent to me some years ago by a lady in Alexandria, Virginia. Now this lady had a 16-year-old son who died of leukemia. And she believes that he communicates to her from wherever he is through this means that she gets these images on certain rolls of film. She'll go 3 or 4 rolls, everything's fine. The next roll will have these things all over it. And you'll say, well, the lady obviously has a malfunctioning camera. But the problem is she gets these with 5 different cameras, 3 Polaroid and 2 35 millimeter. And they come in various sizes, but the shape is always the same. For example, you see the same shape. This, by the way, is in the Pohick Church in Northern Virginia. It's George Washington's chair. Now, the lady sat down to take an automatic time photograph of herself at one time. This is the lady. If you look in the lens of her eyes, she got the same image that she gets on the rolls of her film. So like I say, if you can explain some of these photos, I'd be happy to hear it because I'm still trying to myself. Now, if there are such things as ghosts, what are they? And I think your definition is as good as mine or the experts, because I don't think anyone really knows. And the most common explanation offered by the psychics or parapsychologists is it's the spirit of a person who has died either traumatically or tragically, but is unaware of his or her death. But any definition will do. The professor at the University of Iowa said a ghost is a person who's died and missed the bus. Now they are in general agreement as to the manifestations, the most common being sound. People hear footsteps. They hear them in the attic, they hear them in the basement, on the stairs. They hear sounds of conversation or crying or moaning or screaming. One couple told me they heard the sounds of a party going on downstairs one night, glasses tinkling, chairs being pushed in and out, and laughing. And they raced downstairs, no one there. You have certain aromas, the attar of roses when there's no fresh flowers in the house, or oranges maybe when there's no fruit, very often tobacco smoke when there are no smokers. And you have certain physical phenomena, which is, you might go into a house and one spot's 30, 40 degrees colder, and you walk in and out of that spot. A lady in Fredericksburg called me one time and said in the middle of a July heat wave, 95 degrees outside, her air conditioner was broken. She went upstairs to a back bedroom, the windows were frosted over. And then you have the sightings, the apparitional figures I showed you a few examples of, or people who can look just like you or I in full body form, but very often dressed in period costume of 100, 200 years ago. And if there are such things as ghosts, why might they be? And most often the parapsychologist will tell you it's because they left something undone in life, or some grievance unsettled. There was a classic case in Richmond in the 1840s where Marion Harlan, who was one of Virginia's best-known writers of the 19th century, when she was a 13-year-old girl, she came into her house at dusk one evening, and in the corridor, she saw the figure of a smallish woman with red hair and a tortoiseshell comb in the back of her hair. And she said the woman either vanished or walked through the wall. She wasn't sure, but she was terribly frightened. So she told her father. He called the family together and said, look, we've all seen this woman at one time or another. We don't know who she is or why she's here, but she's apparently not harmful, and we don't want to talk about it because we might have to sell this house. Well, a few years later, they were doing renovations in the front yard, and in a very shallow hole there, they found the skeletal remains of a smallish woman, and beneath her skull was a tortoiseshell comb. And so they had her properly buried, and once that was done, they never saw the apparition again. So that's an example of if there are ghosts, why there are ghosts. Now, as a writer, I can only write so much about footsteps in the attic without getting repetitious and old real quick. So what I've tried to do over the years is seek out the unusual or historic phenomena. And I'd like to show you just a couple examples of that. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is the church on Jamestown Island. The original church there was built in the 1600s. And there's a very colorful legend associated with this church, and it was told to Queen Elizabeth in 1957 when they had the 350th anniversary of Jamestown, and I'm sure they'll tell it to whoever comes for the 400th in 2 years. And that is Dr. James Blair, who was the first president of the College of William and Mary, fell in love with a young lady named Sarah Harrison. Problem was, he was 31 years old, she was only 17. So her parents were dead set against their union. Tried everything they could to break the couple up. But Sarah was a very headstrong young woman. In fact, when they had the wedding ceremony, when the minister said, do you love, honor, and obey? She said, no, obey, 4 times before he finally got the message and moved on. So they were married, and shortly after that, her parents were tragically killed in a lightning storm. And Sarah and Dr. Blair lived a long and happy life, and when they died, they were buried side by side in a little cemetery in back of this church. And there, many years ago, a rather strange thing occurred. A sycamore tree grew directly between 2 stones and began crumbling them apart. And so the legend was instigated that Sarah's parents, who could not separate the couple in life, was so doing after death. And the odd part of it was they cut that tree out within another year or 2. Another one grew in the same spot and continued to push the stones further and further apart. Now this is, to me, one of the most beautiful plantation homes, not just in Virginia, but in all America. This is Shirley Plantation in Charles City County, halfway between Richmond and Williamsburg. And if you go there today, and it's a public place you can visit, you will see hanging prominently in one of the downstairs rooms a portrait of a woman we know as Aunt Pratt. Aunt Pratt was a member of the Carter family. They've lived there for like 14 generations. And she lived about 200 years ago. And about 40 years ago, a new generation of the family moved into the house, did not care for this portrait, I think I can understand why, and took it down and relegated it to the attic. They started having trouble once that happened. They heard the sounds of furniture being banged around the attic and a woman crying. And every time they went up to look, there was nothing out of place. Not even a footstep in the dusk or anything. And finally they decided Aunt Pratt must not be happy in the attic. They brought her back down, hung her in her proper place, and they didn't hear from her anymore. Now, in 1971, and this is documented, the Commonwealth of Virginia was having an exhibition of psychic phenomena in New York City. And they'd heard about Aunt Pratt, and they asked if they could borrow the portrait and take it to New York, which they did. And they started having trouble immediately. The workmen came in one morning, they said Aunt Pratt was somehow off the wall, on the floor, and in their words, halfway to the exit. So for security reasons, they locked her in a closet at night. They heard the same sounds, things being banged around and a woman crying. And one morning when they came in, even though the closet was locked at night, somehow Aunt Pratt had gotten out and again was heading toward the door. Once the exhibit was over, they crated her up, shipped her back to Shirley, where she's hanging prominently now. We've not heard from her again with one exception. And that is about 4 years ago, I got a call from one of the historical interpreters there. And she told me she was telling the story of Aunt Pratt to a group of tourists. And right beneath the portrait is a large armoire. And the man was standing right beneath the portrait. When she got through telling about Aunt Pratt, he said, "That's the biggest bunch of baloney I ever heard in my life." And as he said it, she said, the doors of the armoire suddenly sprang open and banged him sharply in the backside. And they said the room emptied in 10 seconds flat. Okay, now this is not much of a photograph, but it is the entranceway to the George Wythe House in Colonial Williamsburg. Mr. Wythe, to me, is one of the most underrated founding fathers that we have. He was the legal teacher for Thomas Jefferson, Henry Clay, John Marshall, many others. And if this house were to be haunted, and many people say it is, you would suspect it would be the old George himself, because in his old age, his grandnephew poisoned him to gain his inheritance. But he lived long enough to write his grandnephew out of the will. But rather, it's not George Wythe who supposedly haunts this house. It is a woman we know as Lady Anne Skipwith. Now, Lady Anne came to Williamsburg 200 years ago for a fancy ball at the Palace, which is just down the green from this house. And she stayed here while she was in town. And we don't know exactly what happened. She was having marital problems with her husband. She thought he paid too much attention to her older sister. Something miffed her at the dance, and she raced out of the palace back to this house, lost a slipper on the way. So when she went up the stairs, she kind of clip-clopped up, one shoe on, one off. And shortly after that, tragically, she did die, and perhaps her fears were justified because her husband did indeed marry her older sister, Jean. But for the last 50 or so years, there have been multiple witnesses, and this is unusual, highly unusual. There have been custodial workers, tourists, historical interpreters, been in this building at night and swore they heard the sounds of someone going up the stairs as if they had one shoe on, one off, but they see nothing. Well, about 12 years ago, I got a letter from a lady in Seattle, Washington. She come to Williamsburg for a visit and read a little book I did on the ghost of Williamsburg, in which I told the story of Lady Anne. She wanted to go see for herself, went there one night, went to the top of the stairs, took a photo looking down, and this is what happened. You'll see at the bottom of the stairs, appears to be some kind of phantasmal image. Could that be Lady Anne? Who knows? And here we have what the, again, the so-called experts would call a case of crisis apparition. The tradition behind this is that in 1823 there was a sea captain named David Duncan, living in Norfolk, Virginia, was married, had 2 small children. They lived in an apartment. On the night of May 12, 1823, Captain Duncan was off the coast of Italy on a sea voyage. He was down in his cabin reading a book of English poetry called Thoughts on Life, Death, and Immortality, when all of a sudden a flash apparitional fire appeared on the deck of his ship. He raced to the deck, and in the flames he clearly saw an image of his wife and 2 small children, and they were crying, "David, David, help us." And then it was gone. He was terribly upset, apprehensive, but it was several weeks before he did get back to home port, only to learn to his horror that in fact on the night of May 12, 1823, his 2 children and wife had perished in a fire in their apartment in Norfolk. And so he had this unusual tombstone placed in a corner of St. Paul's Cemetery in downtown Norfolk. If you go there today, you can read it, see it. The bottom line reads, "Insatiate archer could not one suffice, thy shaft flew thrice, and thrice my piece was slain." The exact words of English poetry he had been reading the night the apparition of fire appeared on the deck of his ship. So those were just a few of the, what I like to call a little different or unusual phenomena. Now I'd like to say a word or two more about common misconceptions about ghosts. If any of you have seen the Poltergeist 1, 2, or 3, or the Omen 1, 2, or 3, or any of those horrible TV shows or movies where monsters come out of the attic and people get pulled down tunnels and all kinds of wild things go on. People who say they've had actual ghostly experiences, and I've probably interviewed about 1,500 of them over the years, to a person say nothing like that happens. At most, you might catch something whitish out of the corner of your eye, glimpse something fleeting, or you will hear sounds that are inexplicable. But very rare for anybody, any ghost or specter or whatever, to be harmful in any way. 99.9% of them are benign. And I think in some instances, the situations can be downright humorous. And I'd like to give you an example. It's really where people perceived there was a ghost and there really wasn't, and what happened. For example, 30-odd years ago in Colonial Williamsburg, tourism was way down. It was the middle of November. It was cold and misty. And 5 historical interpreters, and I don't make these up, these are all true accounts. I couldn't make these things up. These 5 historical interpreters were invited to go out to New Kent County, the neighboring county, to get a tour of the Episcopal Church and learn of its history. And because of the weather, in addition to their colonial costumes, they had on long cloaks with hoods. And so they were driven out to the church, and they went in, and they had their tour. And when they came out, it was dusk, and they went over and sat down on a bench in front of the cemetery adjacent to the church to await their ride back to town. Now, if you can picture this in your mind's eye, they heard a vehicle come up the road. These 5 women in their colonial costume, with the long cloaks and the hoods, arose in unison, in the dusk, in the mist, with the tombstones in the background, and it wasn't their ride. It was a tourist from New Jersey. And they said he promptly drove into a tree. Over in Harrisonburg, Virginia, there's a place called Stonewall Cottage, where around the year 1900 a lady died. And of course, in those days, you had the coffin right in the house, and the friends and relatives came to the house rather than the funeral parlor as you do today. And they were all gathered in the kitchen, reminiscing. And a lady there asked a young man, would he mind going into the parlor 3 rooms over to get her pocketbook, which she'd left in the parlor. And he said he was never afraid of anything living in his life. The dead, he wasn't so sure about. So when he walked through the parlor, he kind of tiptoed past the coffin. He looked down. He said the lady was laying there, very peaceful repose, eyes closed, arms folded. He took another step or 2, heard a loud clap. I like this because if anybody's sleeping, I always get them. He said he looked out of the corner of his eye, and the lady was sitting bolt upright, staring directly at him. And he could not move a muscle for like 10 minutes. Finally, he ran back into the kitchen. Turns out the undertaker was there. He said, let me tell you what happened. The lady died at night. We didn't find her till the next morning. Partial rigor mortis had set in. So when we wrapped her in a shroud, we had to put a special brace on her neck. And somehow when you walked across that creaky wooden floor, you tripped that brace and that's what popped through. Now, some of these things occurred back in the days before embalming was popular. And one of them was in Southwest Virginia about 150 years ago, where a woman was thought to have died. And the husband called the undertaker, and they came, of course, in a horse-drawn hearse. And they carried her out on the porch on a board, down the steps and across the yard. And one of the men slipped, and the board banged into a maple tree. And the woman's eyes fluttered. And they realized she was still alive, and they worked on her, and she survived. True story, that woman lived 10 years after that. Then she died for real. They came to get her again, and as the men were carrying her out across the yard, the husband came out on the porch and said, "Boys, watch out for that tree there." And there was another case like that. This was told to me by the county historian in Henry County. Said in 1938 there were two people living in a 2-room log cabin. They were very poor. It was very cold. It was on a dairy farm. There was a young man and his grandmother. The grandmother apparently died. And they were so poor, they laid her out on a table and put a sheet over her. Friends and relatives came into the other room, facing the fire, reminiscing. All of a sudden, the sheet began to flutter. The lady sat up. She'd not died. She'd been in some kind of deep catatonic coma, and the heat from the fire had revived her. She slipped off the table, walked over to one of the gentlemen facing the fire, slapped him on the back, and said, "Sure it's cold out tonight, ain't it?" And they said there was a stampede to the front door. The one I like too was told to me a few years ago by a historian in Lexington, who told me that 100 years or so ago there was a church there where the minister, always dressed in white, and to emphasize the point, he would always raise his arm. And one year he found out he was dying of cancer, and he asked if they would bury him under the altar of the church. And they agreed and did. The problem was, people going by there late at night after that swore they saw a figure in white with his arms raised. And it so spooked them, this is true, they built another church down the road. And it was in vogue for fashion for 80 years or so, and then was dilapidated. So they sold the building to a tire store. And my friend said when he was 10 years old, his grandfather would drive him up the main street there, and they would hit a bump, and the headlights would go into the plate glass window of the tire store, and he swore he saw a figure in white with his arms raised. Said it took him several years to figure out he'd been looking at the Michelin Man. Well, let me tell you my favorite, I guess, and then we'll get on with this. And this, again, is true. It occurred in Southwest Virginia about 100 years ago, where they were having a Halloween mask costume party for the 7th grade class in this little school. And a boy decided he would dress up as the devil. Had on a red uniform, pitchfork, horns, tail, the whole bit. They had a 2-mile walk to school that evening. They got about halfway there, and a thunderstorm broke suddenly, and he looked around for the nearest shelter. And off in the corner was light in a little rural church. So he headed there. Well, it turns out they were having a revival. The minister was preaching the book of Revelation. And there was this tremendous streak of lightning and a thunderous boom of thunder. And the front doors of the church sprang open. Everybody looked back, and here's the boy in the devil's costume. He said they went helter-skelter over each other, jumped out of the side windows. The preacher ran out the back door. And only one old man was left. He was crippled. And the boy walked down the aisle to him, and the man looked at him and said, "You know, I've been a member of this congregation for over 50 years, but I've always been on your side." So those are some of the ones. In fact, I did a little book called The Treasury of True Ghostly Humor, which they're included. Let me just say a word or two about how and why I got into this. It's purely by accident. I've been doing some books for publishers in New York, and they asked me to do one on haunted houses. And I came across so much rich material, particularly in Virginia, that I couldn't put in that one book, and I wanted to do a little book called The Ghost of Williamsburg. And they said they weren't interested. They said regional books don't sell. So I went ahead and published it myself. It's called a little book called Ghost of Williamsburg. It's now its 22nd printing, and there's a nightly ghost tour in Williamsburg based on it. So much for my editors and their regional books. I did another one a couple of years later on the Ghost of Richmond. You see they're getting a little larger. I did ones on Fredericksburg, Charlottesville, Tidewater, and one on the Civil War. And then, about 10, 12 years ago, I kind of put it all together and did a book called The Ghost of Virginia, which you can see is much larger, covering the entire Commonwealth. And when I did this, I thought I was absolutely through with the subject because I used every scrap of material I had. Well, about 4 years later, here's The Ghost of Virginia, Volume 5, which has a big chapter on Farmville in it, by the way. And here's the latest, The Ghost of Virginia, Volume 9. And Volume 10 will be out next month. And it's just been unbelievable to me how this much rich material, all of which I think is part of our heritage. I like what John Heatwole said, folklore is a soft form of history. And I think we're in danger of, if we don't preserve it, of losing it in this technological age. So that's been one of the fun things about doing this series. And for a 10-second commercial, I did bring a few books. They're in the back. I'll be happy to sign them. And I'm not trying to make a fast buck. It's just the boxes are heavy. If I could lighten my load just a bit. Let me wind this up by, first of all, telling you, you probably know this well. You've got ghosts right here in Farmville. Marge Swain here has written about some of them, and they're mostly associated with Longwood University. Excuse me. I think when there was an explosion in the labs there many years ago, and the lady that was a professor there, Edith Stevens, I think saved some lives during that disaster, but she lost her own. And apparently, she had a friend named Leola Wheeler, and when Leola died, they placed a marker at the site, but whenever that marker is neglected, apparently Edith comes back appearing as a ball of fire in the attic of the Stevens building, which is more than enough inducement for the workmen to get out there and clear the burial site. And also the spirit of Dr. Joseph Jarman, longtime and long dead president of Longwood, can still be heard walking with his cane through the buildings at night in Jarman Hall. For example, there are times when the electricity, the soundboard, the theater's lights don't work right, and no rational cause is ever found. There are many others associated with the university. Of course, you're familiar with the statue to the Confederate veterans that allegedly the legend is whenever his shadow cannot be seen at night, trouble's on the way. And there are some instances that apparently have occurred when that happened. People always ask me, what is my favorite? And gosh, that's almost like saying, which child do you love the most? But it's very difficult to pick. But let me tell you 2 or 3 if we got enough time for that. And then if anybody has questions afterward, I'll be happy to try to answer them. One of them, I was signing books at the Newport News Fall Festival about 5 years ago, and a very well-dressed lady came up and said, Mr. Taylor, I have something I'd like to tell you, but I know you won't believe it. And I said, listen, I hear that a lot. Go ahead and try me. And she said when she was 12 years old, her grandmother died, and they buried her grandmother in a pearl gray suit. And as they were lowering the coffin in the ground, this girl dropped 3 pink rose petals on top of the coffin because her grandmother had always loved pink roses. Well, 40 years later, this 12-year-old girl, now grown, was in the hospital for a very serious cancer operation. They didn't know if she was going to live or not. She was in intensive care, no flowers, no visitors, nothing. And they were getting ready to take her in the operating room, and a vision of her dead grandmother appeared to her in the same pearl gray suit. And the vision spoke. It said, "Don't worry, you will live to see your children's children." And with that, it vanished. The man came in, and as he lifted the lady from the hospital bed to the gurney to take her in the operating room, 3 pink rose petals floated to the floor. And another one I like is not far from here, and it was in Bedford County. This occurred in the late 1600s when there was a large ghost dog, large black dog, which appeared at a certain mountain pass. It would appear at sunset each evening, walk back and forth about 40 yards as if it were walking down and back on a trail, standing guard over something. And at sunrise each morning, it would dematerialize. Now, again, what was unusual about this phenomena, not that it wasn't unusual in itself, but the number of witnesses that claimed to have seen this dog. They came from all over Virginia, hundreds of them. They tried to capture the dog, they couldn't, they tried to shoot it. They said the bullets went right through it. Well, one year a lady from England came to that area, said, and heard this story, said she had a dog like that her husband had preceded her to America by 2 years and was going to send for her as soon as he got settled. She never heard from him again. She asked if they would take her to the site, and sure enough, that evening at sunset, the dog materialized, but instead of going straight down the trail as it normally did, it went right to the lady. Laid his head in her lap, moaned, got up, started down the trail, looked back to make sure she was following it, got to a certain spot, pawed the ground, and then just evaporated. The lady asked if they would dig at that site, and some men dug, and in a shallow grave found the bones of a very large dog. And beneath them, the skeletal remains of a human male wearing a signet ring, which the lady identified as being that of her husband. And finally, let me close with this. This was sent to me by Gay Neal. Some of you may know she's a historian in Broadnax, Virginia. And I'll read this one because it's in her words. In fact, I think she wrote the history of Brunswick County, if I'm not mistaken. And she called it The Last Ride. She said, "Only once in my life have I seen a ghost. It was not a bad experience at all. Half a mile up my road, there's a mailbox that's slightly askew. It used to read Grover Cleveland Holmes. I lived for over a year there before I actually saw the man. He was sitting on a flat rock by the mailbox that served as a step up the bank to his little gray house. He was an old black man wearing a shapeless gray slick raincoat and some old galoshes. His head had an equally shapeless hat squashed down on it. If I had been going any faster, I would never have noticed him. I stopped to pick up and called out, 'Do you need a ride?' 'Don't need one, ma'am,' he said, but he stood up and he came over to the truck. 'Don't need to go, but I'll take a ride if it comes,' and one always do. 'You going to town?' I asked. 'Yes, Lord,' he said. 'Beautiful day. Praise Jesus.' He preached all the way to town, and when he tried to pay for the ride, I told him he owed me nothing. I'd enjoyed his company. 'Wait a minute,' I said. 'How are you going to get home?' 'Oh, I expect someone to be going my way, and they'd take me along.' I felt good all day. And so quite often through the next few years, I gave Cleveland a ride into town. I slowed down past his little house and checked the big flat stone. If he was there, he'd stand up, smile, slowly climb in and start preaching. He always got home too. Someone was always going his way. One fall, he rode less often. His cousin told me Cleveland was 85 years old and was a World War I veteran. That winter was a cold, dreary one. I didn't see Cleveland for a long time, and I asked his cousin. She said he'd fallen asleep, the fire went out in his house, and his feet froze. He was in the Veterans Hospital. And so, for many months, I didn't slow down when I passed by his house. I missed him, and I missed his homespun sermons. Then one day, I was driving a little too fast down the country road. As I passed by Cleveland's house, I saw in the corner of my eye a figure hunched over by the rock. Gray raincoat, shapeless gray hat, the wide smile. I slammed on the brakes and whirled around to look back, but there was no one there. Just a flat rock. I drove on. That had been Cleveland like I'm plain as day. When I came back home several hours later, the spray of yellowing plastic flowers that some undertaker sticks on all the doors of those who die was hanging behind the sagging screen of Cleveland's house. I felt something turn over in my stomach. I called his cousin. The gangrene got him, she said. They couldn't stop it. So I figured I saw old Cleveland waiting there for someone to be going his way. And sure enough, they were, and they took him along. So those are some of my favorites. Let me close this by, and like I said, I'd be happy to answer questions, by telling you a couple of real brief anecdotes that are not ghostly, but in doing the research for all these books, which I love Virginia history, I came across them, and to me, they're precious. One of them apparently happened in Richmond around the year 1900 when a man was on the 10th floor of a hotel threatening to jump. And in the crowd that gathered was an old Confederate veteran, about 78 years old. And he called up to the man. He says, "Don't jump." He says, "Think of your wife and kids." And the man says, "Well, I'm not married." He says, "Well, think of your mother and father." And he says, "They're dead." And the old veteran says, "Well, think of Robert E. Lee." And the man says, "Who?" And the old veteran says, "Jump, you Yankee son of a bitch." But the one I like to eat better than that was told on General Grant when he was settled into Petersburg for the siege there in 1864. It was said he had a standing order that anyone caught behind his lines without the proper paperwork were to be brought to him personally for questioning. And one day they brought in this elderly farmer. Had on coveralls, and his hair was all frazzled. He was about 80 years old. Grant took one look at him, immediately knew he presented no threat whatsoever as a spy. But for whatever reason, he thought he'd have some fun with him, and he grilled him for like 15 minutes. And finally he said, "Well, old timer, you can go now." And the old farmer, he says, "Well, General, sir, you've been asking me all these questions. Is it all right if I just ask you one?" And Grant says, "Sure, go ahead." The old farmer said, "General, where are you going from here?" Grant thought for a minute, he scratched his head. He said, "Well, I guess I'm going to one of four places. I'm going to Petersburg, I'm going to Richmond, I'm going to heaven, I'm going to hell." The old farmer says, "Well, General, you ain't going to Petersburg because General Beauregard is there. And you ain't going to Richmond because General Lee is there. And you sure ain't going to heaven because General Stonewall Jackson is there." Questions or anything? Yes, sir.
I have two questions. The first one is, have you been told enough ghost stories that involve animals, like the one you said about the dog, to make a separate book of those?
Actually, there are several books have been written about animal spirits.
By you?
Not by me, no. No. I don't think I've had enough. See, I've stuck strictly to Virginia because it's all I can handle. Because in addition to writing and researching and writing, I've got to sell them too. And it's just too much to go beyond, nationally or something like that. But it's a good idea that we discussed earlier. Many times animals have a greater sensitivity to the psychic phenomena than humans. And there are people that, I've included some chapters in some of the books on some spirit animals, but it's an idea, maybe I'll...
And the other question was, how do you distinguish between a spirit, a soul, and a ghost?
I don't really do that. To me, I don't want to get into the...
Would they be all the same, or?
I couldn't answer that. I really don't know. Some people call them ghosts, some people call them spirits, some people, we get into the light and the out-of-body experiences and things like that. That's a little beyond me. What I enjoy doing is someone tells me a good ghost experience that has happened to them, and all I do is recount it. I don't try to interpret it. So that's for other people. Yes?
Have you done any research on the Will-o'-the-Wisp in Cahokia, Virginia, or West Point? Opinion on that one?
I know it's a will-o'-the-wisp.
That's what they used to call it, and that's what we used to go down and look for it.
There's a crossing in the railroad track in West Point, which is that's between Williamsburg and Richmond again. They call it the West Point Light. And I have had more people tell me they have seen this phenomenon than any single thing that I've ever covered. I bet 100 people have told me that. And what it is they say looks like a railroad headlamp coming down from a great distance, getting right up on people, and then disappearing. And the prevailing legend, as far as I could gather, was a troop train with Confederate soldiers wounded and exhausted in 1862 left Richmond to go to West Point for relaxation and recuperation and never arrived. Now, whether or not that's valid, I don't know. But the phenomena got so bad because people went down there. Well, everybody took their dates for one thing, and some of them took shotguns. They killed a farmer's cow and anything else that moved. And the sheriff finally had to cut it off. And it's against the law to be there today. But in fact, they even I think Unsolved Mysteries tried to go in and film a segment. They wouldn't allow them in there. But I have a friend that's an amateur ghost hunter, and he went there one night before it had been closed, and it was very cold, middle of winter. And he set up all his equipment. He had cameras and tape recorders, and a car parked on the other side of the tracks directly across from him. And he said he was there 4 hours and saw absolutely nothing. Was upset, packed up his gear, put it in the car, and here came the light. And he said as he got close to them, the people in the car on the other side of the tracks got spooked, threw the car in reverse and backed off. And in the glare of their headlights, he said he clearly saw the outline of the locomotive engine pass.
Wow.
Somebody else? Yes.
If someone in your family dies, is there a possibility that they could come back a second time? The night before my father died, I dreamed that he died.
Yeah.
And I called in, I was late getting to work that morning. And that afternoon, when I got home from work, I happened to go earlier to the apartment. I received a call that my father had passed away at 6. Mm-hmm. And then later, I don't know how much later, it may have been a year or two, I woke up out of a dead sleep. I don't think I was dreaming, but I felt this hang sort of across my forehead. And I had a small hallway in the hall, and I could hear someone that sounded just like slippers, just shuffling along. That was the most weird experience, and I've been waiting for something to happen again.
Well,
My
again,
mother hasn't come back.
the
Wish she would.
The so-called experts, the parapsychologists, contend that one of the most common forms of ghostly manifestation is right after a person dies, that they make themselves known, and it's to either let you know they're okay where they are, or for them to check on you to see if you're okay, and for them to tell you it's okay to...
Well, another experience that was so unusual was
Yeah.
I woke, one morning I was getting ready to go to work, that at 7 o'clock, I thought, I've got to call my father, something's not right. He dialed me the very moment before I could even pick up, and he said, "Are you okay?"
Yeah.
And I said, "I'm fine."
That's, you'll find many, many examples of cases where, particularly during wartime, say the Civil War, Second World War, whatever, mothers will get the feeling that something's happened to their son, and they may have been killed or wounded at a site thousands of miles away at that very instant. There are many, many cases documented. And it's, how do you explain it? Anybody else? Yes.
I was talking with one of my friends, and he told me about two places near where he lived that he said that he knows for a fact that was haunted. I was just wondering if you've done any research on it. And, one was Freedom's Church in Mount Crawford, Virginia, and Cross Keys near Harrisonburg, Virginia.
No, I haven't done that, but I'll make a note of it. In the back, yes.
I have a question. If somebody, way back when built a house, and then somebody tore it down, and then somebody else built their house there, why do the ghosts still hang around?
That's a good question. A lot of times, well, again, as I say, the experts, and I'm certainly not an expert on the subject, but if there is, usually if you have something in the house, some type of phenomenon, you trace back maybe to a tragedy or a traumatic event in the house. Maybe somebody took their own life, maybe they were murdered, or maybe it was built over or near a cemetery or Indian burial. And that seems to be what might be spawning grounds for ghosts, if there are ghosts. See, it's not uncommon for things like that to happen. Usually you can trace back the history of the house and you'll find something in there that may trigger it. Yes?
I just wanted to mention too, if anybody's nervous about having a ghostly encounter, the only thing I can suggest is that they try to relax, because you mentioned that most of the experiences are positive, not hostile.
Or benign, yeah.
But if they would just relax for a moment, they'll get a real feeling of whether it's friendly or not friendly. And so that way you don't have to be fearful.
Until you realize, if you know, that when after you've been sleeping, you wake up and wonder somebody's in your car.
You can see anything on television, but this pastor went on television and said a ghost has no power to harm anybody. That's what the pastor said.
Well, that's probably virtually true, but there have been some documented cases where the famous Bell Witch of Tennessee is probably a classic example. And that is where this woman who thought she'd been cheated out of some land there by the Bell family harassed the family for months. And Bessie Bell, who was like 13 years old, it was said that she would be sitting in a chair and everyone would hear a loud slap on her face. They would not see any, but the hand imprint would show up on her face. Her father was literally choked by, allegedly, the spirit. And among the witnesses who came to see this over a period of long months was Andrew Jackson. But that's extremely rare, extremely rare. Poltergeists supposedly can throw things around. There's a famous case near Lexington, 1825, where a house was pelted from the outside by rocks. Nobody could see anybody throwing the rocks. And then they also flew around inside the house. And I think one man was slightly injured, but other than that. But there is phenomena where things like that happen. But it's rare, very rare. Yes, sir.
You've been speaking of these things happening 50, 75, 100 years ago.
Yes.
Anything recent?
Oh, yeah. I still get calls from people. I'll give you another example. This is very recent. I was at the Newport News Fall Festival this year. It was just 2 weeks ago. And it was on Sunday, October 2nd, and two ladies came up to me and told me that one of the ladies, they were in, I think, their 40s, never knew her father because her father had left the family before she was born. Her stepfather adopted her. Later in life, she found out she was adopted, and she went to her stepfather and begged him to tell her the name of her birth father. She wanted to track him. And he didn't do it for a long time, but when he left, moved out, he finally told her. And he said, he's got a brother in North Carolina who would be your uncle. And so she got in touch with the uncle, and he said, I don't know where your father is now, but I've got a surprise for you. You've got two sisters and a brother living here in Hampton, Virginia, and that she never knew she had. And so, then she later found her father had died before she could reach him, but this October 1st, she came down, she was living in New York, came down, met the two sisters and brother in Hampton for the first time. They went to dinner. After dinner, they were taking some pictures with a digital camera of all their family with the kids and everything, and every picture was crystal clear. And then someone suggested the four siblings who had just been reunited for the first time to get together for a picture. And in that picture was all kinds of wavy striations and wispy cloud-like stuff covering the photo, and they couldn't understand why. And they changed positions, and it occurred on the second photograph. And the sisters looked up and said, hey, Dad, it's okay, we're together now, you can go on. And after that, the rest of the pictures were clear as a bell. I told them they ought to go on over with that. Okay, well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Halloween is coming up. Need some stories for little goblins and tricksters. This is your opportunity, and also to make great Christmases. Thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Who's the next president?
We don't know yet. Oh, really? Yeah, we've got a nomination.